Sergeant Michael Rossi never thought a peachkin would save his life. The sound starts before you see anything in the Normandy bocage. That's what the veterans told him during the Channel crossing. Hunched in the hold of the LST with diesel fumes making everyone nauseous, and Private Eddie Carlson from Iowa throwing up into his helmet every 20 minutes. The grinding of Maybach engines deeper and throatier than American Detroit's, echoing to the hedgerows like a predator's growl. Corporal Williams, a replacement who'd survived the North Africa campaign before catching malaria and getting rotated stateside for recovery, had described it with particular precision, a man who'd heard that sound in his nightmares for 18 months. "You'll know it when you hear it," Williams said, his hands shaking as he tried to light a cigarette in the wind. "Sounds like God's own garage door opening. Means you got about 30 seconds to make peace with whatever you believe in." But on July 18th, 1944, 3 weeks into Operation Cobra, sound meant nothing when you couldn't pinpoint direction. The smoke from burning fuel dumps had rolled across the St. Lo crossroads for 2 hours, thick as wool, turning noon into twilight and making the summer heat somehow worse. The air heavy and choking like breathing through wet canvas. Inside the Sherman M4A1 Thunderbolt, named by their previous loader, who'd been killed at Corentin and whose blood still stained the floor plates no matter how much Rossi scrubbed. He was loading his 43rd shell of the day when Lieutenant Hayes' voice crackled through the intercom with the words every tank crew dreaded. Panthers. Multiple contacts. No visual. The way Hayes said it, flat and professional, made it worse somehow than if he'd been screaming. The lieutenant had learned in 6 weeks that panic killed you faster than German guns. Rossi was a loader, not an innovator. The son of a Philadelphia steelworker who'd emigrated from Calabria in 1919 with $8 in his pocket and a letter of introduction to a cousin in South Philly who worked the blast furnaces. He'd grown up in the shadow of those furnaces where men respected tradition and distrusted cleverness the way farmers distrust city folks. His father, Domenico, had spent 30 years at the Midvale steel plant pouring molten iron, using the same techniques his grandfather perfected in the old country. Techniques passed down through 4 generations of Rossi men who'd worked metal since before Napoleon marched through Italy. La via vecchia funziona semper. The old man would say every time young Michael suggested a different way of doing something, a shortcut, an innovation. The old way always works. The new way gets you killed, or fired, or worse. Domenico had seen men die trying to be clever around molten metal, had pulled bodies out of furnaces when someone thought they knew better than tradition. Michael inherited that skepticism about newfangled ideas the way he inherited his father's thick forearms and tendency towards silence, which made what happened next even more unlikely. Innovation wasn't in his blood. Survival was. The crew had been together since Fort Benning. Hayes, the young lieutenant from Connecticut who graduated West Point 6 months before Pearl Harbor with enough family connections to have gotten a safe posting stateside, but had volunteered for armor because his older brother died at Kasserine Pass, and Hayes needed to prove something to a ghost. Kowalski, the gunner from Detroit whose father built the very Shermans they crewed at the River Rouge plant, and who could tell you the thickness of every armor plate and the precise muzzle velocity of their 75mm gun and how it compared to the German 88, and why that comparison should terrify you. Driver Hernandez from El Paso, who could coax their 30-ton machine through mud that swallowed other tanks whole, who'd learned to drive on his uncle's farm in New Mexico, coaxing ancient tractors through arroyos, and somehow that translated to being able to feel what the Sherman needed before the gauges told you. And Rossi, who'd volunteered for armor because his draft notice arrived the same week his father died in a foundry accident when a crucible cracked and 15 tons of molten steel spilled across the floor, and Domenico Rossi pushed 2 younger men out of the way and took the full stream himself. And Michael figured die in a steel box felt like honoring the old man somehow, like completing a circle. They'd landed at Omaha Beach on D+3, June 9th, coming in on a flat-bottomed LST that scraped bottom 50 yards from shore, and they had to wade through water up to their chests with the Sherman's waterproofing system barely working, engine coughing like a dying man, all of them certain they'd drown in sight of the beach their brothers had died to take 3 days earlier. They fought through the hedgerows for 6 weeks after that, learning the brutal mathematics that the training manuals didn't teach you and the veterans wouldn't speak about until you'd seen it yourself. Sherman versus Panther. American crews needed 5 tanks to reliably kill 1 German cat, And even then, 2 of those 5 Shermans weren't going home. The Germans called their doctrine 5 brothers for 1 cat. The Americans didn't have a name for it. They just knew that every time you saw that low-slung profile with the sloped armor and the long gun, you calculated your odds, and they were never good. They'd already lost 2 sister tanks that morning. Bonnie Parker at 0630 when they crested a rise, and a Panther was waiting the tree lean with a perfect sight picture, 1 shot to the glassy plate, and the whole crew gone in a fireball that you could feel half a mile away. And Memphis Belle at 1,000 hours to what they thought was a Panther, but turned out to be something worse, a tiger, which was like comparing a grizzly bear to a great white shark, when you're the seal. The smoke was artificial, German doctrine perfected on the Eastern Front. The Wehrmacht had learned in 3 years of fighting the Soviets that American and British tank crews depended on their vision, their superior optics, their forward observers, and air support. Take away visibility, and the technological advantage evaporated. So the 88mm guns would lob smoke shells to screen their counterattacks, white phosphorus that burned and spread, and created walls of gray that no periscope could penetrate. And then the Panthers would move through it like sharks in murky water, hunting by sound and instinct and experience of men who've been killing tanks since Kursk. Standard defensive play. The Americans had learned to respect it, even if they hadn't learned to counter it. The Panthers would be moving through it now, hunting. Rossi could hear Hayes calculating odds over the intercom, his voice steady, but strained in that way that meant he was thinking about writing letters to 5 sets of parents, and whether his own mother would get the telegram or the personal visit from the notification officer. They had perhaps 90 seconds before those 75mm KWK-42 guns found them, guns that could punch through a Sherman's frontal armor at 2,000 meters, and they were sitting at maybe 300 meters judging by the sound. And Sherman armor might as well be cardboard against that kind of penetration. It was like being in a gunfight with a pistol against a rifle, except the rifleman was invisible and you were standing in a phone booth. Kowalski was traversing the turret blindly, trying to acquire targets through periscope sights that showed nothing but gray, his hands moving with the mechanical precision of a man who'd done this 10,000 times in training, but never once when it actually mattered, when the target was real, and would kill you if you missed. Rossi could hear him breathing hard over the intercom, could hear the slight wheeze that meant Kowalski's childhood asthma was acting up again, even though he lied on his physical to get into the service. Hernandez had already shifted to reverse, the transmission grinding in that particular way that meant second gear was going out again, and they'd need to requisition a replacement if they lived long enough to reach a maintenance depot, ready to back them into a defilade position behind a hedgerow that might save them if they got bracketed by artillery. Everyone knew the drill. Everyone knew it probably wouldn't matter. Rossi had loaded and unloaded this gun so many times his arms moved without thought, muscle memory from 10,000 practice rounds at Fort Benning and 2,000 combat rounds since landing, and he was already reaching for the next shell before he consciously decided to do it. His body preparing to fight, even though his brain was screaming that there was no point. You can't kill what you can't see. That's when Rossi noticed the can. He'd eaten peaches from it that morning, a rare luxury from a supply dump they'd overrun 2 days ago when the Germans retreated so fast they left food and ammunition, and in one case a motorcycle that Hernandez immediately claimed and tried to get running until Hayes told him that joyriding through a combat zone was a good way to get shot by your own side. The can sat wedged between ammunition racks, forgotten until this moment. Just another piece of trash in a tank that smelled like cordite and sweat and diesel and fear. But Rossi wasn't thinking about peaches. He was thinking about his Uncle Giuseppe's workshop in South Philadelphia, 3 blocks from the Rossi house, where the old man repaired accordions and mandolins and sometimes guitars for the Irish and Polish families that were moving into the neighborhood as the Italians moved out to suburbs. Giuseppe had been deaf in one ear since the Great War. Austrian shell burst at Caporetto in 1917. The disaster that killed 300,000 Italians and broke the Italian army and sent Giuseppe home with half his hearing gone and shrapnel in his shoulder that clicked when the weather changed. But he could tune an instrument perfectly by feel and by watching how air moved through the bellows and over the reeds. Rossi had spent 1,000 afternoons in that workshop, from age 6 until he enlisted, supposed to be helping but mostly watching as Giuseppe's gnarled fingers worked magic on instruments that seemed beyond repair. Io suono ha derision, the old man would say, holding thin paper strips near the sound holes in the accordion to see which way they fluttered when he pumped the bellows. Sound has direction. Air carries it. You can see it if you know how to look. He'd explained it to young Michael with the patience of a man who'd survived a war and knew that teaching was how you defeated death, how you passed something forward that mattered more than medals or grief. The idea hit Rossi like shrapnel, sudden and complete and terrifying in its simplicity. Sound has direction. The Maybach engines, the squeaking bogie wheels, the distinctive rattle of Panther tracks, all of that was sound traveling through air, and air moved. And if it moved, it created pressure, and pressure could be detected, and direction could be derived, and somewhere in that chain of logic was survival, if he was fast enough and lucky enough, and if Hayes didn't think he'd lost his mind. He grabbed the can, pulled his combat knife from the sheath on his belt. The knife his father had carried in the foundry, the handle wrapped in leather that had absorbed 30 years of sweat and was smooth as glass, and started punching holes around the rim. Not random, though it might have looked that way to someone who didn't understand. Deliberate, asymmetric, the way Uncle Giuseppe had showed him for testing airflow in accordion bellows, how you needed different size holes in different positions to understand which direction the air was moving and how fast, and with what pressure. 3 holes on the forward-facing side, each about the diameter of a pencil, punched with the tip of the knife blade and twisted to clean the edges. 2 holes on each flank, smaller, quarter-inch maybe, positioned to catch crosswinds and side pressure. None on the rear, because air moving away from you didn't matter, didn't tell you where the threat was, only where it had been. He threaded paracord to the holes. The 550 cord they all carried, rated for 550 pounds and useful for everything from tying down gear to making tourniquets to hanging yourself if the war got bad enough, and some guys had. Fashioning a crude harness with the kind of knots his father had taught him for securing loads in the foundry, knots that wouldn't slip under pressure. The whole crew thought he'd crack from stress. You saw it sometimes, men who just broke and started doing incomprehensible things because their brains couldn't process the fear anymore and shut down in weird ways. "Rossi, what the hell?" Hayes demanded over the intercom, his voice carrying particular edge of a commander who's watching a trusted man lose his grip at the worst possible moment. "We got Panthers in the smoke, and you're doing arts and crafts?" Kowalski turned from his sights, sweat streaming down his face because the turret was like an oven in summer, and they'd been buttoned up for 6 hours, the temperature inside pushing 120 degrees. "Mike, buddy, if you're having a breakdown, can you do it later? I need you loading, not whatever that is." But Rossi was already moving with the certainty of a man who'd done complex physical work his whole life, and understood that sometimes your hands knew things your brain hadn't caught up to yet. He popped the loader's hatch, against every instinct, against every regulation, against the most basic survival impulse that said you never, ever open up during contact, because snipers and fragments and everything that kills came through open hatches, and secured the can to the turret side with a paracord, angling it forward like a primitive ear trumpet, like the hearing aids he'd seen old men use at church when Father Moretti gave his sermons. The wind from the artillery bombardment, from burning vehicles, spewing black smoke into the white phosphorus, from the movement of massive German tanks through smoke, all that air had to go somewhere. It had to flow through those holes. And the sound, the Maybach engine noise that you could supposedly hear from 1,000 meters on a quiet day, the track clatter that sounded different from American tracks because the Germans used interleaved road wheels that created a distinctive rhythm, the high-pitched squeak of Panther bogies that every tanker learned to identify the way a mother learns her baby's cry. All of that would create pressure differentials as it moved through the holes. The pitch would change based on direction. The way a train whistle sounds different depending on whether it's coming at you or moving away. Basic physics. Doppler effect. Uncle Giuseppe's physics applied to killing. He dropped back inside, sealed the hatch, felt the temperature differential like jumping into cold water, from 100-degree sunshine into 120-degree metal box, and pressed his ear against the turret wall near where he'd mounted the can. At first, nothing but chaos. Explosions as their own artillery tried to suppress the German advance, their own engine coughing because Hernandez was revving it to keep them ready to move, and the carburetor was foul from low-grade fuel. Radio static, because every tank in the battalion was calling contacts and requesting support and reporting casualties. The noise was overwhelming, a physical force that made his teeth hurt and his vision narrow. But then, filtering through like a voice in a crowd when you're listening for your name, a change in tone, a rising pitch from 11 o'clock, subtle but distinct. The way a mosquito sounds different when it's flying toward your ear versus away from it. The Doppler effect of something massive moving closer, displacing air, pushing sound waves ahead it like a bow wave. 11 o'clock, Rossi shouted over the intercom, his voice cracking because his throat was raw from breathing smoke and dust, and he hadn't had water in 3 hours. 200 meters, closing fast. He could hear his own heartbeat, could feel in his temples, could taste copper fear on his tongue. Hayes hesitated for only a heartbeat. They had nothing else, no better option, no magical solution from headquarters or from the forward observers who couldn't see through smoke any better than they could, and something in Rossi's voice carried certainty, carried away to a man who just bet his life, and everyone else's on physics and tin. Kowalski traversed left standby. The gunner swung the turret with the whine of electric motors, aimed at smoke and hope and coordinates provided by a loader having what might be a brilliant insight or might be a fatal delusion. Fire when ready. The 75 millimeters barked. The breech slammed back on its recoil spring hard enough to shake the whole tank. Rossi was already loading another shell through pure muscle memory before his brain registered what happened next. 54 pounds of metal and explosive, sliding it home, slamming the breech closed, slapping Kowalski's shoulder to signal ready. The whole sequence taking 4 seconds, because that's what survival required, and what training had burned into muscle that moved without thought. Through the smoke, impossible to see but impossible to mistake, a fireball, orange and red and black. The distinctive wump of ammunition cooking off when the shell penetrated and found the stored 75 millimeters rounds that every Panther carried and turned the tank into a bomb. Hayes got on the radio immediately, his voice higher now, excited in a way their previous commander never got excited, because Lieutenant Morrison had been through Africa and Italy and had seen everything twice. But Hayes was young, and this was impossible, and impossible things were allowed to be exciting. Thunderbolt to all able elements, confirmed Panther kill grid. But Rossi wasn't listening. His ear was still pressed to that spot on the turret wall, and the tone was changing again, a lower frequency from 1 o'clock, different harmonic. The way different notes on Uncle Giuseppe's accordion produced different patterns in the paper strips. Another tank, another Maybach engine, another mass of steel moving through air and announcing itself to anyone who knew how to listen. 1 o'clock, 150 meters. His voice was steadier now because they'd done it once, and maybe it wasn't luck. Maybe it was real. Maybe they weren't about to die. Kowalski traversed right without hesitation this time. Fired without question because the first shot had bought him faith in tin cans and loaders who had crazy ideas. Another explosion tore through the smoke wall. The crew erupted in shocked profanity. Hernandez screaming something in Spanish that Rossi didn't understand, but that sounded like prayer and celebration mixed together. Kowalski laughing the kind of laugh that wasn't really humor, but was release of tension that could kill you if you held it in. 2 kills. Blind kills. Impossible kills that were happening anyway. The next 4 minutes unfolded with mechanical precision born from pure survival instinct and 6 weeks of combat that had taught them how to function when function was the only thing between life and death. Rossi called bearings, his ear pressed to that spot on the turret wall until his ear hurt, listening to pitch variations that shouldn't have been audible over the din of battle but somehow were, because desperation gives you senses you didn't know you had, because humans can do impossible things when death is the alternative. 3 o'clock, fire, kill, the Panther exploding so violently that they felt concussion to their own armor 30 meters away. 12 o'clock, fire, hit, but no brew-up, no secondary explosion. Probably a track shot or a grazing hit on the slope glacis, where shells sometimes skated off if the angle was wrong. Rossi adjusted his estimate, listening to how the pitch changed as the damaged Panther tried to pivot. Called correction based on sound alone, pure acoustic hunting the way submarines track targets in the dark. They fired again, lower this time, aiming for where the sound said the target was. And another fireball confirmed the kill. The mathematics of armor warfare was inverting in real time. 6 weeks of brutal lessons being rewritten by a peach can and a loader who remembered his uncle's workshop. 1 Sherman. For Panthers dead or die in smoke too thick, to see your hand in front of your face. Smoke that should have been German advantage, but had somehow become American opportunity, because one man refused to accept that smoke meant death. The fifth contact came from behind them, 2 o'clock rear. The tone drop-off telling Rossi the target was moving across their rear arc rather than toward them, probably trying to flank around and get a side shot where the Sherman's armor was thinnest. Hernandez, 20-degree pivot right. The driver spun them with practiced skill, the transmission screaming in protest but responding. Kowalski tracking the turret to follow, Hayes calling out the relative bearing to make sure everyone understood the geometry. They fired on Rossi's mark, the shell catching the Panther as it crossed an invisible line that Rossi could hear but not see, and it erupted like a Roman candle. The turret blown clean off by the internal explosion and tumbling through smoke like a child's toy. The sixth was the closest, barely 100 meters at 10 o'clock. The pitch almost a scream as it charged through smoke trying to close for a point-blank kill. The German commander probably thinking that American tanks couldn't shoot what they couldn't see and closing distance was the only play. They got it at 70 meters, so close they felt the heat of its death through their armor, so close that burning fuel splashed across their glassy plate, and Hernandez was screaming that they were on fire until Hayes yelled that it was the other guy's fuel, and they were okay. They were alive. They'd done the impossible. Then silence. Not real silence. Artillery was still pounding somewhere to south. Small arms fire rattled from the infantry positions behind them. Someone's radio was playing big band music impossibly, because some radio man had the frequency wrong. But combat silence, the absence of immediate death. The wind shifted the way it does, nature indifferent to human violence, and smoke began to clear in patches and swirls, revealing the battlefield in fragments like a photograph developing. What they saw shouldn't have been possible. 6 Panthers. All 6 burning, brewing up as the tankers called it, spewing black smoke from burning rubber and diesel to mix with the gray phosphorus smoke. Turrets blowing off 3 of them, the others just burning from the inside out, metal coffins cremating their crews. Their own Sherman untouched, unblemished except for the scorch marks where the last Panther's death had splashed them. Around them, other Shermans of platoon were pulling back to rally positions, some damage. Cold steel, trailing hydraulic fluid from a hit that had penetrated the sponson but somehow missed a crew. Dixie Girl, with a track thrown and limping on bogies, but no catastrophic losses, no fireballs, no crews burning. The entire German counterattack, built around those 6 Panthers supported by infantry that had been shredded by American machine gun fire when their tank support died, had collapsed because the cats died blind. Hayes ordered them to pull back while the smoke gave them cover. Standard doctrine after contact, establish defensive position, and prepare for the next attack, because the Germans never quit, never stopped coming. Not until you killed every last one of them. But not before their sister tank, Cold Steel, pulled alongside. Lieutenant Morrison on the radio demanding to know what kind of witchcraft just happened, how Thunderbolt got 6 kills in smoke when Morrison's crew couldn't get one despite having twice Rossi's experience. Rossi climbed out with a peach can, still dangling from its paracord, holes punched rough and asymmetric, the whole thing looking like something a child made in shop class. He showed them without words, because what words could explain it? This saved us, this piece of garbage, this innovation born from remembering an old man's workshop, and Morrison just stared at it, and then at Rossi, and then started laughing the way men laugh when they've been saved by something so ridiculous that the only response is laughter or tears, and laughter is less embarrassing. The story spread like fire through the battalion, faster than radio, faster than official reports, the way stories do when they're about survival, and men need to believe survival is possible. By sunset, half the battalion knew about Rossi's resonator, and by full dark you could hear tankers everywhere arguing about physics and sound, and whether it was genius or luck, and whether luck even mattered if it worked. By morning, the regimental S, 2 intelligence officer, a major from Boston who'd taught physics at MIT before the war and understood exactly what Rossi had stumbled onto, was interviewing him with a technical sergeant taking notes in shorthand and photographing the device from every angle with a Graflex camera, treating the tin can like it was the crown jewels. By mid-morning, division engineers were examining the device, running calculations on resonance frequency and directional acoustics with slide rules and mechanical calculators, trying to reverse engineer inspiration into something reproducible. The theory was simple enough. The asymmetric holes created a crude directional filter, amplifying sounds from forward arcs while dampening rear noise through acoustic interference. And the metal cylinder acted as a resonance chamber that made pitch variations more pronounced through harmonic amplification. The practice was pure battlefield innovation, the kind of desperate ingenuity that wins wars not in the planning rooms of West Point or in the laboratories of MIT, but in the mud and blood, where men refuse to die quietly, where survival requires invention, because doctrine has failed and tradition is just another word for yesterday's corpses. They stamped it Rossi Resonator in the after-action reports, though Rossi himself called it Uncle Giuseppe's gift whenever anyone asked, which became more frequent as the story spread beyond battalion to regiment to division, and eventually to SHEF headquarters, where staff officers who'd never heard a shot fired in anger discussed whether this crude device should be standardized and distributed. Within a week, tank crews across 3 divisions were fabricating their own versions from whatever cans they could find: peaches, beans, Spam, anything cylindrical with metal sides that would resonate. The machine shop started producing standardized models with precisely calibrated holes drilled at specific angles and proper mounting brackets, welded to fit Sherman turret profiles. By August, the modification was being issued as standard equipment to every Sherman crew in the ETO. By September, Army technical manuals included installation instructions with diagrams and specifications. By October, the innovation spread to Italy and then to the Pacific, where Marines used modified versions to detect Japanese tanks in jungle terrain. A peachkin had become doctrine, had been absorbed into the vast bureaucratic machine of the American military and processed and standardized and distributed as if it had always existed, as if some general had ordered it rather than a loader remembering his uncle's workshop. But Rossi wasn't thinking about manuals or doctrine or his growing reputation, as tankers started calling the Wizard, and then just was when they needed his name to fit in conversation. He wasn't thinking about any of that on July 18th when they finally pulled into an assembly area 5 kilometers behind the line, into a farmer's field where the grass had been crushed flat by tanks and half-tracks, and the air smelled like diesel and summer and distant death. He was thinking about his father, about Uncle Giuseppe, about South Philadelphia and accorded repair shops, and the old ways that sometimes turn out to be exactly what you need when the world goes to hell. He was thinking about Lieutenant Hayes, who trusted a loader's crazy idea when he had every reason not to, when regulations said shut up and followed doctrine, and commanders didn't listen to sergeants having desperate inspiration. He was thinking about the 6 Panther crews who died in those burning tanks, who were sons and brothers just like him, whose mothers would get telegrams just like his mother got one when Domenico died, and how war makes murderers of mechanics and heroes of fools, and somehow you have to live with being both. They put him in for a Silver Star, though it got downgraded to bronze in paperwork shuffle, because medals require witnesses and documentation, and clear chains of command reporting, and somehow the 6 dead Panthers and the testimony of 30 men who saw it happen wasn't quite enough for the decorations board that met in rear echelon safety and made judgments about valor they'd never witness. Rossi didn't care. Medals don't bring you home. The Can did that. The Can and Hayes' trust in Kowalski's shooting and Hernandez's driving, and the pure dumb luck that Rossi happened to eat peaches that morning instead of hash, because if he'd eaten hash from a rectangular tin instead of peaches from a cylinder, then maybe the idea never comes. Maybe they die blind in the smoke like the crews before them. Maybe his mother gets a telegram and spend the rest of her life wondering what her son's last moments were like and whether he suffered. He kept the original Can, dented and scorched from heat and use, wired it to his kit, so it wouldn't get separated from him during the chaos of movement and combat. It became a talisman, a reminder that survival sometimes hangs on the thinnest threads, or the flimsiest tin. Other crews asked to touch it for luck, the way ball players touch sacred bats, and Rossi let them because who was he to say that luck wasn't real when he'd survived 6 Panthers by listening to a vegetable can? The war ground on. Operation Cobra broke through the German lines 3 days later. The massive artillery bombardment that killed hundreds of American soldiers in friendly fire, but broke the German defensive line and opened the way for Patton's Third Army to pour through into Brittany. Thunderbolt and her crew fought across France into Belgium, through the Siegfried Line where the hedgerows gave way to concrete bunkers and dragon's teeth anti-tank obstacles, crossed the Rhine at Remagen on the pontoon bridge after the Ludendorff Bridge collapsed and took 28 men with it. They lost Hernandez to a mine in the Hurtgen forest, lost him stupidly and wastefully the way the Hurtgen killed everything. When he stepped out to check the track after they threw it on a tree stump, and a bouncing Betty sent ball bearings through his legs and stomach, and he bled out in 4 minutes while Rossi held his hand, and Hernandez called for his mother in Spanish, and died at 19 years old, died after surviving Normandy in the breakout, and 3 months of combat, died because he stepped on the wrong square meter of forest floor. His replacement, a kid from Wisconsin named Patterson, who'd been in country for 3 days and still had that new uniform smell that made veterans avoid him because they knew the odds, lasted 2 weeks before taking shrapnel during the Bulge when a German 88 airburst caught their column and peppered the tank with fragments that shouldn't have penetrated, but did through the open hatches they'd been stupid enough to leave open during movement because it was cold and they wanted air, and that mistake cost Patterson's life and taught the rest of them that there was no such thing as being too careful, only being alive or dead. Kowalski survived until April 1945, made it through the winter and the Bulge and the Rhine crossing, and the final push into Germany itself. Survived until they were in Nuremberg, and everyone was saying the war would be over in weeks, and then caught a sniper bullet in the neck while he was eating his morning rations, standing outside the tank because the morning was beautiful and spring was coming and Germany was dying, and for 5 seconds Kowalski let himself forget that war doesn't care about beauty or spring or how close you are to going home. Rossi held him while he died too, watched the light go out of eyes that had aimed the gun that killed dozens of German tanks, eyes that had trusted Rossi's mad innovation with peach cans and kept them all alive. And Kowalski tried to say something, but the bullet had taken his voice along with his life, and he just looked at Rossi with an expression that might have been surprise or might have been disappointment that he'd made it so far only to die in a city that was already surrendering. Hayes made it home, went back to Connecticut, taught history at a prep school where the boys wore blazers, and called him sir, and had no concept of what war meant beyond what they read in books. He never talked about the war, except once a year when Rossi visited, making a trip down from Philadelphia on the train, and they'd get drunk on expensive Connecticut whiskey that Hayes could afford on a teacher's salary supplemented by family money, and they'd remember the morning a peachkin changed everything, would remember Hernandez and Kowalski and Morrison, who died when cold steel hit a mine in the Ruhr pocket, would remember all the men who made it to May 8th and all the men who didn't. Rossi himself came back to Philadelphia in August 1945 on a troop ship packed with men who'd survived and who were having trouble believing they were allowed to go home while so many hadn't. He married a girl from the old neighborhood, Teresa Delmonico, whose brother had died on Saipan and who understood about grief and survival and not asking too many questions about the nightmares that woke him up screaming for the first 5 years after he came home. He took over his uncle's repair shop when Giuseppe died in 1953, died peacefully in his sleep at 81, which seemed like an impossible age for a man who'd survived the Great War and the Depression and everything else the 20th century could throw at him. Rossi fixed accordions and mandolins, taught his sons about sound and direction and airflow, never told them about the Panthers until they were grown, because how do you explain to children that their father killed men, that he's good at killing, that he saved lives by taking lives, and somehow has to be proud of that and ashamed of it simultaneously? The gun sat on a shelf in the workshop, a museum piece nobody understood except Rossi and the few old tankers who'd make the pilgrimage to South Philadelphia to see it, to touch it, to remember the day impossible became possible because someone was desperate enough to try. The Army kept the innovation in service through Korea, though helicopters and improved radio communications, and then eventually infrared optics made the resonators obsolete by Vietnam. Some Cold War training manuals still reference the Rossi device as an example of battlefield adaptation versus top-down doctrine, teaching young officers that sometimes the best innovations come from the bottom up, from the men actually doing the killing and dying rather than from the men planning campaigns and safety. Military historians studied it as a case study in innovation under pressure, wrote papers about it, included it in textbooks used at West Point and Annapolis. But for the men who lived through Normandy in July 1944, who faced Panthers and smoke and survived because a loader remembered his uncle's lessons about sound and direction, the story was simpler and more profound. Sometimes a peach can is just a peach can. Sometimes it's a difference between a telegram to your mother and growing old enough to tell your grandchildren, why you still can't eat canned peaches without getting shaky, why the smell of phosphorus from fireworks makes you want to vomit, why you wake up some nights hearing Maybach engines in the distance, and you're 70 years old and safe in South Philadelphia, but some part of you is still 23, and listening to the pitch change that means death is coming from 11 o'clock. Michael Rossi died in 1987, 64 years old, which should have been young, but war ages you in ways that don't show on calendars. Heart attack in a workshop. Surrounded by instruments that sang when the air moved through them just right, surrounded by the tools and sounds and smells of the work that connected him to his uncle and his father and to some sense of purpose beyond survival. They buried him with full military honors, a detail from the Pennsylvania National Guard, who folded the flag with precision and presented it to Teresa, who'd been his wife for 42 years and who knew him better than he knew himself, but still couldn't fully understand what the war had taken from him, what it had given him, how those two things were sometimes the same thing. The Bronze Star was pinned to his uniform. The ribbon faded now because he'd worn it every Veterans Day and Memorial Day for 4 decades, worn it not from pride, but from obligation to the men who hadn't come home to wear theirs. The original can, though, the real hero of St. Lo Crossroads, that went to the Army Museum at Fort Benning, where it sits in a climate control case alongside the preserved hulk of an M4A1 Sherman, not Thunderbolt, but a sister tank that died at Bastogne. The placard explains the physics, explains acoustic directionality and resonance, and Doppler effect in language that makes it sound like science when it was really just desperation and memory and a man refusing to die. It lists the tactical situation, explains the bocage terrain and the German smoke tactics and the 5-to-1 loss ratio that made every tank encounter a nightmare. It notes the number of enemy destroyed. 6 Panthers in 6 minutes. It doesn't mention Uncle Giuseppe or accordion repair, or how traditions sometimes save you when innovation kills. It doesn't mention that Rossi never felt like a hero, just a loader who ate peaches at the right time and remembered something important when seconds mattered. But that's not the part that haunts the story. The part that keeps it alive in the oral tradition of tank crews 70 years later, when men who never met Rossi tell a story to younger men who will never face Panthers, but who face different threats and need to believe that innovation matters, that individual action counts for something against institutional inertia. It's the simplicity of it. A can, hose, string, air and sound, and a human ear pressed against metal. No computers, no infrared, no thermal imaging, no laser rangefinders, no technology more sophisticated than what a medieval smith might understand if you explained it carefully. Just a man who paid attention, who remembered lessons from an old artisan, who refused to accept that smoke meant death simply because everyone else accepted it. In an age of smart weapons and satellite targeting, of warfare conducted by drone operators continents away from the killing, of precision strikes launched from aircraft the enemy never sees, there's something primal and pure about Rossi's solution that resonates beyond military history. It reminds us that for all our technology, for all our advances, wars are still won by humans making desperate decisions with whatever's at hand, by people who remember that knowledge isn't just what you learn in school or read in manuals, but what you absorb from craftsmen and artists and old men who survived previous wars and know things that can't be written down because they live in muscle memory, an instinct and the ability to see connections that formal education blinds you to. The 6 Panthers died in 6 minutes on July 18, 1944. The battle for Normandy took 83 days. The war in Europe lasted another 10 months after St. Lo. 10 months of grinding advance and bitter fighting, and casualties that accumulated until you stopped counting and just hoped you'd be one of the ones who made it home. But on that morning at a crossroads nobody remembers the name of anymore, a peach can change the mathematics of survival. Alter the calculus that said American tanks were coffins and German tanks were predators, and nothing you could do would change that equation. It's a small story in the vast narrative of World War II, barely a footnote in the official histories that measure the war in divisions and campaigns and strategic objectives achieved. But if you ever find yourself in Fort Benning, if you make the pilgrimage to the Army Museum and stand in front of that dented, scorched cylinder in its climate control case, press your ear close to the glass the way museum guards hate, but never quite forbid, and listen. You might still hear echoes of May. Bach engines grinding through smoke, the distinctive pitch change that meant death was coming from 11 o'clock, and the voice of a 23-year-old loader from Philadelphia who refused to die before solving the problem, who remembered that sound is direction, and air carries it, and sometimes that's enough. The old ways work, his father said. Sometimes the new ways do too, especially when they're built from remember what the old ways taught us about listening, really listening, to what the world is trying to tell you. Sound is direction. Air carries it. Uncle Giuseppe knew it. Michael Rossi remembered it. And 6 Panther crews died because one loader connected those facts into innovation when innovation was the only thing standing between his crew and telegrams to Philadelphia. Sometimes survival hangs on threads that thin, on memory and improvisation, and the willingness to look like a fool if it means your brothers might live, on the belief that physics still works even when everything else has failed, that the universe operates by rules that don't care about armies or doctrine or the superior armored German tanks. On a peach can and some string, and an ear press of metal. Listening for the pitch change, that means you found the predator before it found you. That means you get to go home instead of burning in a metal coffin. That means your mother doesn't get the telegram and 40 years later you die in a workshop in Philadelphia Surround.